The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos stepped out of her worn pickup truck. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from 12 years in Special Forces. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her civilian clothes couldn't hide the alertness in her brown eyes that constantly scanned her surroundings. Maria had volunteered to help train new recruits at Fort Braxton, a favor for her old commanding officer who was short-staffed. She'd been out of active duty for 6 months now, working as a private security consultant, but the skills never left. If anything, civilian life had sharpened her awareness of threats in ways military life never had. The training facility buzzed with activity as young recruits moved between obstacle courses and weapons training areas. Most were barely out of high school, full of bravado and testosterone, convinced they already knew everything about being a soldier. Maria had seen thousands like them over the years. Some would make excellent soldiers. Others would wash out before basic training ended. "You must be Santos," called a voice behind her. Maria turned to see Captain Reynolds, a stocky man in his 40s with graying temples. "Thanks for coming out. We got about 40 recruits going through weapons familiarization today. Nothing too complex, just basic rifle handling and safety protocols." Maria nodded. "What's the breakdown? Any problem cases I should know about?" Reynolds grimaced slightly. "Most are solid kids, but we've got a group of 5 who think they're already Navy SEALs. Ringleader is a kid named Jake Morrison. 20 years old, comes from money, thinks his dad's connections will fast-track him to special operations. He's been undermining the drill instructors and trying to establish himself as some kind of alpha." "Sounds familiar," Maria said. She'd dealt with plenty of privileged recruits who thought military service was just another way to prove their superiority. Most learned humility quickly. The stubborn ones usually found themselves assigned to the most unpleasant duties until they adjusted their attitude. The weapons training area was set up in the shadow of a large warehouse building. Long tables held disassembled rifles that recruits would learn to clean and reassemble. Beyond that, shooting lanes extended toward distant targets. Everything was organized with military precision. Safety zones clearly marked and range safety officers positioned at regular intervals. Maria watched as the recruits filed in for the morning session. She quickly identified Morrison and his crew. They swaggered rather than walked, spoke louder than necessary, and made jokes during the safety briefing that showed they weren't paying attention to the instructor. Morrison himself was tall and athletic, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of confident smile that suggested he'd never faced real consequences for his actions. His followers were cut from similar cloth, though none quite matched his natural charisma. They wore their civilian clothes like uniforms, expensive athletic gear that looked fresh from a store. The morning started smoothly enough. Maria circulated among the recruits, correcting grip positions and answering questions about weapon mechanics. She noticed that most of the young soldiers showed her immediate respect when they learned about her Special Forces background. Word traveled fast through the group that the quiet woman helping with training wasn't just any instructor. But Morrison's group remained deliberately aloof. They whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing in Maria's direction with expressions that ranged from skeptical to openly dismissive. She'd seen the look before. Some men, especially young ones from privileged backgrounds, simply couldn't accept that a woman might know more about warfare than they did. Around mid-morning, during a break between exercises, Morrison approached Maria while she was checking ammunition supplies. His 4 friends formed a loose semicircle behind him, close enough to provide backup, but far enough away to maintain plausible deniability if things went wrong. "So you're the famous Special Forces lady we've been hearing about," Morrison said, his tone carrying just enough mockery to be insulting while staying within the bounds of apparent politeness. "Must have been tough, being one of the only women in that boys' club." Maria looked up from her clipboard, meeting his gaze steadily. "It had its challenges," she said simply. She'd learned long ago that the best response to provocation was often the most understated one. "I bet," Morrison continued, emboldened by what he mistook for weakness in her quiet response. I mean, how much actual combat did you really see? Most women in the military are in support roles, right? Communications, medical, logistics. Nothing wrong with that, but it's not exactly the same as being on the front lines. His friends snickered, clearly enjoying what they saw as their leader putting the uppity female instructor in her place. Maria noticed that other recruits had begun to watch the interaction, some looking uncomfortable with Morrison's obvious disrespect, others curious to see how she'd respond. "I did my job," Maria said, still maintaining her calm tone, "just like everyone else." Morrison stepped closer, lowering his voice so only his immediate group could hear. "Come on, lady. We all know how these things really work. You probably spent most of your deployment sitting in air-conditioned command centers while real soldiers did the actual fighting. Nothing wrong with playing it safe, but don't pretend you're something you're not." One of Morrison's friends, a redhead named Collins, decided to join the fun. "My uncle was in Afghanistan with the Rangers. He told me all about how they had to babysit the women soldiers, make sure they didn't get hurt. So it was more dangerous having them around, because you had to protect them instead of focusing on the mission." Maria set down her clipboard and turned to face the group fully. Her movements were deliberate and controlled, but something in her posture caused the nearest recruits to unconsciously take a step back. It was subtle, but those who'd been in enough dangerous situations to recognize the signs saw it immediately. This wasn't a woman being intimidated. This was a predator deciding whether the annoyance in front of her was worth the energy to address. "That's an interesting perspective," Maria said, her voice still level but carrying an undertone that made Morrison's friend suddenly look less confident. "Your uncle sounds like he had strong opinions about women in combat." Collins, missing the warning entirely, pressed on. "Yeah, well, he knows what he's talking about. He was in real combat, not whatever watered-down version they gave women. I mean, look at you. You're what, 5'6", 130 pounds? How are you supposed to carry a wounded 200-pound soldier to safety? How are you supposed to hold your own in hand-to-hand combat against enemy fighters who've been training to kill since they were kids?" The gathering crowd of recruits had grown larger, drawn by the obvious tension. Some of the older non-commissioned officers had noticed the situation and were moving closer, ready to intervene if necessary. But they held back, curious to see how their guest instructor would handle the challenge to her authority. Morrison sensed the attention and decided to escalate. "Look, I'm not trying to be disrespectful here. I'm sure you're a fine person and you served your country to the best of your ability. But let's be realistic about what that service actually involved. This is 2024, not some feminist fantasy where women are physically equal to men. Biology matters. Combat effectiveness matters. And pretending otherwise just puts everyone at risk." Maria smiled for the first time since the conversation began, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "You know what, Morrison? You're absolutely right about biology. Physical differences between men and women are real. Size matters. Strength matters. But you know what matters more than either of those things?" She paused, letting the question hang in the air, while Morrison's confidence began to waver slightly. Something in her tone suggested this wasn't going where he'd expected. "What matters most," Maria continued, "is knowing when you're overmatched and acting accordingly. It's understanding that the biggest, strongest, most aggressive person in the room isn't always the most dangerous one. It's recognizing that real combat isn't a wrestling match or a boxing match. It's a chess game where the smartest, most prepared, most ruthless player wins." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm educating you," Maria replied. "See, you're looking at me and seeing a small woman who probably never fired a shot in anger. You're making assumptions based on limited information and your own preconceptions. That's exactly the kind of thinking that gets soldiers killed in real combat situations." She stepped closer to Morrison, close enough that he had to look down slightly to meet her eyes. Despite her smaller stature, something about her presence made him want to step backward. He forced himself to hold his ground, but his friends shifted nervously behind him. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at you," Morrison, Maria said quietly. I see someone who's never been tested. Someone who's had everything handed to him and mistakes privilege for competence. Someone who thinks respect is something you demand rather than something you earn. And most importantly, I see someone who's about to learn a very valuable lesson about the difference between confidence and arrogance. The crowd around them had grown silent. Even the background noise of the training facility seemed muted as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Morrison's face flushed red, anger and embarrassment warring for control of his expression. You know what? Morrison said, his voice rising. Maybe it's time someone showed you what real soldiers are capable of. Maybe you need a demonstration of why men have always been the ones who do the actual fighting while women stay safe at home. Captain Reynolds, who had been watching from a distance, started moving toward the group. He could see the situation spiraling out of control and knew he needed to intervene before someone did something that would end careers and possibly result in criminal charges. But Maria held up one hand in his direction, a subtle gesture that somehow conveyed both appreciation for his concern and confidence that she could handle the situation. Reynolds hesitated, then stopped, trusting in her judgment, but ready to move if needed. A demonstration sounds educational, Maria said to Morrison. What did you have in mind? Morrison looked around at the watching crowd, realizing he'd painted himself into a corner. He'd challenged a military instructor in front of dozens of witnesses and now needed to follow through or lose face completely. His friends were watching him expectantly, waiting for their leader to prove his dominance. Hand-to-hand combat, Morrison said finally. No weapons, just skill against skill. Let's see how your special forces training stacks up against someone who actually has the physical tools to be effective. Maria nodded thoughtfully. That's one option. But if we're going to do this, let's make it realistic. Real combat isn't usually a fair fight. Real enemies don't follow sporting rules. They use every advantage they can get, including weapons. She gestured toward the weapons training area where rifles lay disassembled on tables. How about this instead? You and your friends think you understand what it means to be a soldier. You think you know how combat works. So let's run a scenario. A realistic one. Morrison's confidence returned. Whatever game she wanted to play, it couldn't be worse than trying to wrestle with someone who probably had specialized martial arts training. What kind of scenario? Simple, Maria said. You 5 against me. You'll have access to the training weapons. I'll be unarmed. Your mission is to capture or neutralize me. My mission is to escape. We'll use the entire training area as our battlefield. Laser tag equipment will register hits, so there's no ambiguity about who wins. The crowd murmured with excitement and concern. This was far beyond anything they'd expected to see during a routine training day. Several of the NCOs looked ready to shut down the whole thing, but Maria's calm confidence gave them pause. She clearly knew what she was doing. Morrison looked at his friends, then back at Maria. 5 armed men against 1 unarmed woman. Even a trained one seemed like overwhelming odds. And with a laser tag system, no one would actually get hurt. It would be a perfect opportunity to prove his point about physical realities while giving her a face-saving way to back down when she realized she was outmatched. You're serious about this? Morrison asked. Completely, Maria replied. Unless you're having second thoughts about demonstrating what real soldiers are capable of. The challenge in her voice sealed it. Morrison couldn't back down now without looking like a coward. Fine, when do we start? Captain Reynolds stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but recognizing that stopping it now might cause more problems than letting it play out. If we're doing this, we do it safely and by the book. Full safety protocols, official range safety officers, medical personnel standing by. This is a training exercise, not a personal grudge match. Over the next 30 minutes, the training area was transformed into an impromptu battlefield. The warehouse building and surrounding equipment provided cover and concealment opportunities. Safety boundaries were established, and laser tag equipment was distributed and tested. Medical personnel took positions at strategic points around the perimeter. Morrison and his friends spent the preparation time studying the layout and developing their strategy. With 5 people and Maria alone, they felt confident about their chances. The weapons were familiar military rifles, modified to fire harmless laser beams instead of bullets. Each participant wore sensors that would register hits and eliminate them from the exercise. Maria spent her preparation time in quiet meditation, running through various scenarios and possibilities in her mind. She'd been in similar situations before, though never as a training exercise. The principles were the same: assess the environment, identify advantages and disadvantages, develop multiple contingency plans, and remain flexible as the situation evolved. As the official start time approached, both sides took their positions. Morrison's team entered from the north end of the training area, moving in a loose formation that suggested they'd been paying attention during their tactical training classes. Maria entered from the south, alone and apparently unarmed, walking with the casual confidence of someone taking a morning stroll. The whistle blew, and the exercise began. Morrison immediately began issuing orders to his team, positioning them to cut off Maria's escape routes while maintaining overlapping fields of fire. It was textbook small unit tactics, the kind of approach that would work well against most opponents. But Maria wasn't most opponents. She moved through the training area like she belonged there, using every piece of cover and concealment to her advantage. Within minutes, it became clear that this wouldn't be the quick demonstration Morrison had expected. What he didn't know was that Maria had spent the last 6 months working as a security consultant, helping design training scenarios for exactly these kinds of situations. She'd walked this ground during the setup phase, noting sight lines, cover positions, and potential weaknesses in the facility's layout. More importantly, she'd been studying Morrison and his friends since the moment she'd arrived that morning. She knew their personalities, their likely reactions under stress, and their probable tactical preferences based on their behavior during earlier training exercises. The hunters were about to discover they'd become the hunted. The first few minutes of the exercise played out exactly as Morrison expected. His team moved in coordinated bounds, communicating through hand signals and maintaining visual contact with each other. They divided the training area into sectors and were systematically clearing each one, confident that their superior numbers and firepower would quickly corner their lone opponent. Maria seemed to be doing exactly what a smart person would do when outgunned and outnumbered. She stayed hidden, moved carefully from cover to cover, and avoided direct confrontation. Morrison felt vindicated in his earlier assessment. This was just a woman trying to survive against superior opposition, exactly as he'd predicted. Colin spotted her first, catching a glimpse of movement behind a stack of wooden training barriers near the warehouse building. "Contact, northwest corner," he whispered into his radio. "She's moving toward the main building." Morrison smiled grimly as he adjusted his team's positions. The warehouse was a dead end. Once Maria was inside, they could surround the building and force her surrender. It would be over in minutes, and he'd have proven his point in front of everyone watching from the safety zone. "Stevens, Rodriguez, take the east side. Collins, you're with me on the west. Martinez, cover the main entrance. Don't let her back out once she's inside," Morrison commanded, feeling like a real military leader directing his first combat operation. His team moved into position with textbook precision. Years of training videos and classroom instruction had given them a solid foundation in small unit tactics. Against most opponents, their approach would have been devastatingly effective. Maria watched their movement from inside the warehouse, having entered through a service door that Morrison's team had failed to account for in their hasty reconnaissance. She'd been inside for several minutes already, using the time to familiarize herself with the building's layout and prepare for what was coming next. The warehouse was filled with training equipment, storage containers, and maintenance supplies. Multiple levels of catwalks and storage areas provided excellent concealment and unexpected angles of approach. Most importantly, there were several exit routes that weren't visible from outside the building. Through the windows, Maria, could see Morrison's team taking their positions around the building. They moved with the confidence of predators who'd cornered their prey. Their body language showed they thought the exercise was essentially over. She pulled out her radio, using the communication system that all participants wore for safety purposes. "Morrison, this is Santos. I'm inside the warehouse. You move." Morrison's voice crackled back immediately, filled with satisfaction. "Surrender now, and we'll call it a learning experience. You fought well, but it's over." "Interesting perspective," Maria replied. "Before you declare victory, you might want to check your six." Morrison frowned, not understanding what she meant. Then, Stephen's voice came over the radio in a tone of confused alarm. "A boss? I've got a problem here. My weapon just went dead." "What do you mean, dead?" Morrison demanded. "I mean, the laser system shows I've been eliminated. But I never saw anyone shoot at me. I was watching the building the whole time." Rodriguez's voice joined the conversation a moment later. "Same here. My gear says I'm dead, but there's nobody around me." Morrison felt the first stirrings of real concern. "That's impossible. She's been inside the building since we started moving in. There's no way she could have gotten behind you without us seeing her." "Well, somebody shot me," Stevens insisted, "and it wasn't friendly fire because I was alone on this side of the building." Maria's voice came back on the radio, still maddeningly calm. "Morrison, you might want to reconsider your tactical assessment. You're down to 3 effectives, and the exercise is just getting started." The watching crowd had grown larger as word spread through the training facility about the unusual demonstration. Officers and NCOs who'd initially dismissed the exercise as a minor training incident were now paying close attention. Someone with Maria's background didn't volunteer for public challenges unless they were confident about the outcome. Captain Reynolds stood near the safety officer's position, monitoring radio traffic and watching the exercise unfold through binoculars. He was beginning to understand that what he'd initially seen as a potential disciplinary problem was actually turning into a masterclass in advanced tactical thinking. Morrison's remaining team members were Collins and Martinez, both looking increasingly nervous as they realized their overwhelming advantage had somehow evaporated. Morrison himself was struggling to understand how Maria had eliminated 2 of his people without leaving the building they had surrounded. "Regroup at the main entrance," Morrison ordered. "We'll go in together and clear the building room by room. She can't hide forever." But as his team moved toward the warehouse entrance, Maria was already 3 steps ahead of them. She'd anticipated their most likely response and prepared accordingly. The warehouse had maintenance tunnels that connected to the adjacent buildings, routes that weren't marked on any of the maps Morrison had studied during his preparation time. Collins reached the main entrance first, weapon raised and ready. As he stepped through the doorway, the laser sensors on his vest immediately registered a hit from somewhere above and behind him. His equipment went dead, and a safety officer's voice confirmed his elimination over the radio. "What the hell?" Collins shouted, spinning around to see where the shot had come from. But the warehouse was filled with shadows and concealment, and Maria was already moving to her next position. Morrison and Martinez entered more cautiously, using proper room-clearing techniques and staying alert for ambush positions. But they were thinking in terms of conventional tactics, assuming their opponent would fight like a conventional soldier. Maria wasn't fighting conventionally. She was using techniques learned from years of unconventional warfare training, combined with the kind of creative problem-solving that Special Forces personnel developed through constant exposure to impossible situations. She'd rigged a simple mechanical device using maintenance equipment found in the warehouse, creating a remote-activated laser projector that could simulate rifle fire from a fixed position. While Morrison's team focused on the decoy, she was free to maneuver into positions they never expected. Martinez was the next to fall, eliminated by laser fire that seemed to come from 3 different directions simultaneously. His confusion was evident in his radio report. "I'm hit, but I can't tell where it came from. There's nobody here." Morrison found himself alone in a building that seemed to have turned against him. Every shadow could hide his opponent. Every sound could be a threat or a distraction. The confident team leader who'd entered the warehouse minutes earlier was rapidly being replaced by a nervous young man who was beginning to realize he was completely out of his depth. "Santos, where are you?" Morrison called out, his voice echoing through the warehouse. "Right here," came the reply from directly behind him. Morrison spun around, raising his rifle, but there was no one there. The voice had seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, possibly transmitted through the building's ventilation system or reflected off the metal surfaces in ways that made localization impossible. "You're good at following doctrine," Maria's voice continued, now seeming to come from somewhere above him. "Your room-clearing technique is exactly what they taught you in training. Your team coordination was solid. Your initial positioning showed good tactical thinking." Morrison turned in a slow circle, trying to identify her location while keeping his rifle ready. "So what's your point?" "My point," Maria said, her voice now coming from a completely different direction, "is that doctrine only works when your opponent follows the same rules you do. Real enemies don't read the same field manuals you studied. They don't fight fair. They use every advantage they can get, including the fact that you expect them to fight the way you've been trained to fight." Morrison was beginning to sweat despite the cool air in the warehouse. This was nothing like the exercises he'd practiced with his fellow recruits. Those had been predictable, following established patterns and procedures. This was chaos, and he had no training for dealing with chaos. "You wanted to know about my combat experience," Maria continued, her voice now seeming to come from multiple locations simultaneously. "Let me tell you about combat. Combat isn't about being the biggest or the strongest or the most aggressive. Combat is about being the smartest, the most adaptable, and the most ruthless. It's about using your brain instead of your muscles." Morrison's radio crackled with Captain Reynolds' voice. "Morrison, report your status." I'm still in the building," Morrison replied, trying to keep the uncertainty out of his voice. "Target is somewhere nearby, but I can't get a visual." "And your team?" Morrison looked around at the empty warehouse, remembering that all 4 of his teammates had been eliminated in the span of just a few minutes. They're out of the exercise." The silence that followed spoke volumes. Morrison had started this demonstration with 5 armed men against 1 unarmed woman, and now he was alone, confused, and rapidly losing confidence. Maria's voice came one more time, closer now, and carrying an edge of steel that made Morrison's blood run cold. "Tell me, Morrison, how does it feel to be outmatched? How does it feel to realize that all your assumptions about military effectiveness were based on ignorance and prejudice?" Morrison raised his rifle and fired wildly in the direction he thought the voice had come from, but the laser beam found only empty air. His shot counter showed he'd used most of his allotted ammunition without hitting anything. "That was your mistake right there," Maria said, now speaking from somewhere behind and to his left. "Panic fire. Wasted ammunition. Loss of fire discipline. In a real combat situation, you'd be dead right now." Morrison spun toward the new voice location, but again found nothing. "Stop playing games. Fight me properly." "I'm fighting you properly," Maria replied, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "I'm fighting to win, using every advantage I have. You're fighting to prove a point about gender superiority. We're not even playing the same game." Morrison realized with growing horror that his opponent was toying with him. She could have eliminated him at any time during the last several minutes, but was choosing not to, probably to make some kind of educational point. The humiliation was worse than defeat would have been. "You know what the real difference is between men and women in combat?" Maria asked, her voice now coming from directly in front of Morrison, but still invisible. "It's not physical strength. It's not aggression. It's not any of the things you think matter." Morrison aimed toward the sound, but hesitated to fire, knowing he was down to his last few shots and couldn't afford to waste them. "The real difference," Maria continued, "is that women in combat positions know they have to be twice as good to get half the recognition. They know they're going to be underestimated and dismissed. So they work harder, train longer, and think more creatively than their male counterparts. They have to, A sound from Morrison's left made him turn, and for a split second he caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision. He fired instinctively, but the laser beam struck a metal storage container where no one was standing. "Last shot," Maria observed. "What's your plan now?" Morrison looked down at his rifle, realizing that his ammunition counter showed 0 remaining. He was effectively disarmed in a building with an opponent who'd systematically eliminated his entire team and was now stalking him for reasons he was beginning to suspect had more to do with education than victory. "I surrender," Morrison said quietly. "Louder," Maria instructed. "The safety officers need to hear you clearly." "I surrender," Morrison shouted, his voice echoing through the warehouse. The exercise was officially over, but Maria wasn't finished with her lesson. She stepped out from behind a stack of equipment, not 10 feet from where Morrison was standing, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in her environment. Morrison stared at her in shock. "You were right there the whole time?" "Part of the time," Maria confirmed. "Sometimes I was in the catwalks, sometimes in the maintenance areas, sometimes outside the building entirely. You were so focused on traditional hunting patterns that you never considered I might be hunting you." As they walked toward the warehouse exit, Morrison struggled to process what had happened. "But how did you eliminate my team? You were unarmed when the exercise started." Maria smiled. "I was unarmed with weapons you could see. But this building is full of equipment that can be repurposed with a little creativity. Maintenance tools, laser pointers, mirrors, anything that can redirect or simulate laser fire. Special Forces training isn't just about shooting and fighting. It's about thinking outside conventional parameters." They emerged from the warehouse to find the entire training facility watching them. The crowd had grown to include most of the staff and recruits, all eager to hear about the exercise that had become the day's major entertainment. Captain Reynolds approached them with an expression that mixed amusement with professional interest. "Santos, that was either the most educational training demonstration I've ever seen or a complete violation of about 12 different safety protocols." "Probably both," Maria admitted. "But I think the educational value outweighs the protocol issues." Morrison's 4 eliminated teammates were waiting near the safety officer's station, looking shell-shocked and confused. They'd all been eliminated so quickly and unexpectedly that none of them fully understood what had happened. "Ow!" Stevens asked simply. Maria looked at the 5 young men who'd started the morning convinced of their superiority and were now struggling to understand how completely they'd been outmaneuvered. "You want the technical breakdown or the philosophical one?" she asked. "Both," Morrison said, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by genuine curiosity. Maria spent the next 20 minutes explaining her tactics in detail. The decoy laser projector, the use of building infrastructure for concealment and misdirection, the psychological warfare of the radio communications, and the way she'd used their own assumptions and expectations against them. But more importantly, she explained the mindset that made such tactics possible. The willingness to think beyond conventional parameters. The ability to turn disadvantages into advantages through creative problem solving. The importance of studying your opponent and understanding their likely responses. Special Forces isn't about being superhuman, Maria concluded. It's about being creative, adaptable, and ruthless in pursuit of mission objectives. Physical capability matters, but mental capability matters more. Morrison listened to every word, his worldview undergoing a fundamental shift. He'd started the day convinced that military effectiveness was primarily about physical dominance and aggressive action. He was ending it with a completely different understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. "I owe you an apology," Morrison said finally. "Everything I said earlier was ignorant and disrespectful. You've proven that in ways I can't argue with." "Apology accepted," Maria replied. "But more importantly, I hope you've learned something that will make you a better soldier." "I have," Morrison said. "But I have to ask, could you have eliminated me at any time during the exercise?" Maria looked at him thoughtfully. "What do you think?" Morrison considered everything that had happened, remembering the times when he'd felt like he was being watched or when sounds had seemed to come from impossible directions. Yes, you were probably behind me multiple times when I never saw you. Then why didn't you? Because the point wasn't to win quickly, Maria said. The point was to teach you that winning isn't about physical dominance. It's about being smarter than your opponent. Today you learned that lesson the easy way, with laser tag equipment in a controlled environment. Hopefully, that means you'll never have to learn it the hard way in actual combat. The watching crowd began to disperse as the formal training schedule resumed, but the impact of the morning's demonstration would be felt throughout the base for weeks to come. Stories of the exercise spread quickly, growing in the telling until Maria's tactics took on almost legendary proportions. More importantly, Morrison and his friends spent the rest of their training period with a completely different attitude toward their instructors and their fellow recruits. They'd learned humility the hard way, and it made them better soldiers. 3 weeks later, Maria returned to Fort Braxton for what was supposed to be a routine follow-up training session. Captain Reynolds had specifically requested her help with an advanced tactics course, and several other instructors had expressed interest in learning about the unconventional methods she'd demonstrated during the warehouse exercise. The story of Morrison's humiliation had spread throughout the military community, evolving with each telling until Maria's tactics had become the stuff of legend. Some versions had her eliminating entire squads without being detected. Others claimed she'd used advanced technology that hadn't been available to the recruits. All of them missed the point entirely. Maria arrived at the base to find an atmosphere that felt different from her previous visit. There was tension in the air that hadn't been there before, and several of the training staff seemed nervous when they greeted her. Captain Reynolds met her at the main gate with an expression that suggested problems. "We need to talk before you start training today," Reynolds said, leading her toward his office. "We've had some developments since your last visit." Maria followed him into the small building that housed the training administration offices. Reynolds closed the door and gestured for her to take a seat, but his body language suggested this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. "What's the problem?" Maria asked directly. Reynolds sighed heavily. "Morrison's father is Congressman Richard Morrison. Apparently, the story of what happened here reached him through unofficial channels, and he's not happy about his son being humiliated by some washed-up female soldier," as he put it. Maria felt a familiar coldness settle in her stomach. She'd dealt with powerful people protecting their children before, and it never ended well for anyone involved. What kind of pressure is he applying? The kind that gets people transferred to undesirable assignments and budgets cut for training programs, Reynolds said grimly. He's claiming that you used unauthorized equipment and violated safety protocols to embarrass his son. He's demanding a formal investigation and wants you barred from any future training activities. And the base commander's response? Reynolds looked uncomfortable. Officially, he's supporting the investigation. Unofficially, he thinks you did exactly what needed to be done and is grateful someone finally knocked some sense into Morrison Jr. But politics is politics, and Congressman Morrison has friends on the Armed Services Committee. Maria nodded, understanding the position Reynolds and his superiors were in. Military officers couldn't afford to make enemies of powerful politicians, even when those politicians were protecting spoiled children who needed discipline. "So what do you need from me?" Maria asked. "Honestly, I need you to lay low until this blows over. Don't give Morrison Sr. any ammunition to use against us. Keep the training simple and by the book. No creative tactics, no advanced demonstrations, nothing that could be twisted into evidence of improper conduct." It was exactly the kind of bureaucratic cowardice that had driven Maria to leave active duty in the first place. The military was full of capable officers who knew the right thing to do, but were prevented from doing it by political considerations and career concerns. But before Maria could respond, Captain Reynolds' phone rang. He answered it with a sharp Reynolds, then listened for several seconds while his expression grew increasingly grim. When Reynolds asked, "How many?" Another pause. "We'll be right there." He hung up the phone and looked at Maria with an expression that mixed urgency with resignation. That was base security. We've got a situation in the main training area. Morrison and his friends have apparently decided to prove themselves by challenging some of the advanced trainees to an unauthorized combat exercise. Maria felt her stomach drop. What kind of exercise? The kind that involves live ammunition and no safety supervision, Reynolds said, grabbing his radio and heading for the door. Morrison convinced 4 second-year trainees to participate in what he's calling a realistic training scenario. They're using the old demolitions range on the north side of the base. As they drove toward the training area, Reynolds filled in the details. Morrison had spent the 3 weeks since his humiliation stewing over his defeat and planning some kind of redemption. He'd convinced himself that the warehouse exercise hadn't been a fair test of his abilities because Maria had used unconventional tactics and equipment. His solution was to organize his own training exercise, one that would prove his tactical skills against opponents who couldn't rely on tricks or technological advantages. He'd recruited 4 second-year trainees who were known for their aggressive attitudes and willingness to bend rules. The demolitions range they'd chosen was officially off-limits for unsupervised training, but Morrison had used his father's political connections to obtain access codes and override the safety systems. What was supposed to be a simple combat exercise had escalated into something far more dangerous. How much ammunition do they have access to? Maria asked as their vehicle approached the range area. That's the problem, Reynolds said grimly. The demolitions range has full combat loads available for advanced training scenarios. If they've accessed that equipment, they're essentially conducting live-fire exercises without any safety oversight. The sound of gunfire reached them before they could see the range itself. Automatic weapons fire, intermixed with the distinctive crack of rifle shots and the occasional explosive pop of grenades. It sounded like a real firefight, not a training exercise. This is way beyond anything they should be attempting unsupervised, Reynolds said, stopping the vehicle at a safe distance from the range. We need to shut this down before someone gets seriously hurt. But as they approached the range perimeter, it became clear that the situation had already spiraled completely out of control. Morrison's team had set up defensive positions on one side of the range, while the 4 second-year trainees had established their own positions on the opposite side. Both groups were using live ammunition and real explosives, treating the exercise as a genuine combat scenario. Base security is en route, but they're going to need at least 15 minutes to get here with proper equipment, Reynolds said. By then, someone could be dead. Maria studied the tactical situation through binoculars. Morrison's group was using the same kind of conventional tactics they'd employed in the warehouse exercise, but now they had the advantage of prepared positions and heavy firepower. The second-year trainees were more experienced, but they were badly outnumbered and outgunned. Both sides were deeply committed to proving themselves, which meant they were unlikely to respond to orders to cease fire. They put their reputations and pride on the line in a public forum, and backing down would be seen as an admission of weakness. We need to intervene directly, Maria said. Someone needs to get in there and stop this before it becomes a casualty situation. Reynolds looked at her incredulously. That's suicide. There's live fire coming from both directions. No one can safely enter that range until the shooting stops. I can, Maria said simply. Reynolds started to object, then remembered what he'd witnessed 3 weeks earlier. If anyone could navigate a live-fire situation without being detected, it would be someone with Maria's background and demonstrated abilities. Absolutely not, Reynolds said firmly. I'm not authorizing any action that puts additional personnel at risk. We wait for base security and handle this through proper channels. But as he spoke, the sound of gunfire intensified. Someone screamed in pain, and radio chatter from the range indicated that at least one participant had been wounded. The training exercise had officially become a combat casualty situation. Reynolds, people are getting hurt, Maria said. Every minute we wait increases the chance of serious injuries or fatalities. You know what needs to be done? Reynolds struggled with the decision. Officially, he should wait for proper backup and handle the situation through established protocols. Unofficially, he knew that Maria was probably the only person available who had the skills to end the firefight quickly and safely. If you do this and something goes wrong, both our careers are over, Reynolds warned. If we don't do this and someone dies, our careers won't matter, Maria replied. Another burst of automatic weapons fire echoed across the range, followed by the distinctive whistle of an incoming grenade. The explosion sent dirt and debris flying, and the screaming that followed indicated multiple casualties. "Do it," Reynolds said finally. "But for God's sake, be careful." Maria had already started moving toward the range perimeter, studying the layout and identifying her approach routes. The demolition's range was larger and more complex than the warehouse facility, with multiple buildings, earthen barriers, and equipment installations that provided both cover and hazardous obstacles. Morrison's team had established their position in a cluster of concrete buildings near the center of the range. They had clear fields of fire in multiple directions and access to the range's ammunition storage facilities. The second-year trainees were spread out among the target areas and observation posts, using their better training to compensate for inferior positions. The wounded were from both sides, but they were all in exposed positions where medics couldn't safely reach them. Several participants were calling for ceasefire over the radio, but the team leaders on both sides were refusing to stand down without some kind of face-saving resolution. Maria approached the situation the same way she'd approached dozens of similar scenarios during her active duty career. First, she studied the tactical situation until she understood each participant's motivations and likely responses. Then, she identified the key decision-makers whose actions would determine the outcome. Finally, she developed a plan that would neutralize the threat while minimizing casualties. The plan she settled on was characteristically unconventional. Instead of trying to physically stop the fighting, she would use psychological warfare to make both sides believe they were under attack by a superior force. Fear and confusion would accomplish what direct intervention couldn't. Maria entered the range through a maintenance access point that wasn't covered by either side's defensive positions. She moved carefully, but quickly, using the sound of gunfire to mask her approach and the range's complex layout to avoid detection. Her first target was the ammunition storage facility that Morrison's team was using to resupply their weapons. It was a hardened concrete bunker with electronic locks and security sensors, but Maria had learned to bypass such systems during her Special Forces training. Inside the bunker, she found exactly what she'd expected: thousands of rounds of ammunition, dozens of grenades, and several more sophisticated weapons that Morrison's team hadn't yet discovered. She also found the range's electronic warfare equipment, used for advanced training scenarios. Maria spent several minutes setting up what military personnel called disruption devices, electronic systems designed to jam communications, create false signals, and generally sow confusion among enemy forces. In training scenarios, they were used to simulate the effects of sophisticated electronic warfare attacks. When she activated the devices, both sides' radio communications went dead simultaneously. But, more importantly, their weapon sights and targeting systems began displaying false information, making accurate fire nearly impossible. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Morrison's team, who had been dominating the firefight through superior firepower and position, suddenly found their weapons malfunctioning and their communications cut off. The second-year trainees, who had been desperately trying to coordinate their defense, were equally affected. Both sides assumed they were under attack by some kind of advanced electronic warfare system, possibly deployed by approaching base security forces. The mysterious technical failure created exactly the kind of confusion and uncertainty that Maria had experienced when facing superior forces in actual combat. But Maria wasn't finished. Using the range's public address system, she began broadcasting what sounded like military communications from an approaching rapid response team. Her voice, disguised by electronic filters, reported multiple casualties and the deployment of advanced non-lethal suppression systems. The psychological effect was devastating. Both sides, already rattled by their equipment failures, became convinced that they were about to be overwhelmed by superior forces using weapons and tactics they didn't understand. Morrison's voice could be heard across the range, shouting for his team to regroup and prepare for extraction. The second-year trainees were calling for immediate medical support for their wounded. Both sides had essentially abandoned their original conflict in favor of dealing with a new threat. Maria used their distraction to move through the range and reach the wounded personnel. Her medical training allowed her to provide immediate treatment for the most serious injuries while guiding the less severely wounded to safety positions. Working quickly and efficiently, she managed to extract 5 wounded soldiers from the combat zone and get them to positions where proper medical personnel could safely reach them. None of the injuries were life-threatening, but several required immediate hospital treatment. With the casualties cleared and both sides thoroughly demoralized, Maria made her final move. She shut down all the electronic warfare systems and restored normal communications, then used the public address system to deliver a message that both sides would never forget. Attention all personnel on Range 7. Maria's voice echoed across the facility. This is Santos. Exercise is terminated. All weapons to be safed and secured immediately. Medical personnel are standing by for casualty evacuation. Do not attempt to resume hostilities. The silence that followed was absolute. Morrison and his team, crouched in their concrete bunker, stared at each other in shock and disbelief. The second-year trainees, scattered among the range facilities, experienced the same moment of stunned recognition. They'd been outmaneuvered again, this time in a situation where the stakes were real and the consequences could have been fatal. The woman they dismissed as an uppity instructor had just demonstrated capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. Within minutes, base security vehicles arrived to secure the range and transport the wounded to medical facilities. Captain Reynolds coordinated the official response, while Maria quietly extracted herself from the area, avoiding the inevitable questions and investigations that would follow. Later that evening, after the wounded had been treated and released, after the official incident reports had been filed, and after Congressman Morrison had been briefed on his son's latest misadventure, Maria found herself back in Captain Reynolds' office. "The good news," Reynolds said, "is that everyone's going to survive. The bad news is that this incident is going to generate about 6 months of paperwork and probably 3 separate investigations." "And Morrison's father?" Reynolds smiled grimly. "Apparently, having your son nearly killed in an unauthorized live-fire exercise tends to put political revenge in perspective. He's more concerned about keeping Jake alive long enough to graduate than he is about pursuing complaints against you." Maria nodded, understanding that the political threat had essentially neutralized itself. Morrison Jr.'s reckless behavior had endangered his own future more effectively than any outside pressure could have. What happens to Morrison now? Disciplinary action, obviously, extended additional training under very close supervision, and a formal letter in his file that will follow him throughout his military career, Reynolds said. More importantly, he's finally learned the lesson you were trying to teach him 3 weeks ago, which is that being a warrior isn't about proving how tough you are. It's about being smart enough to avoid situations where toughness is irrelevant. Over the following months, Maria continued her work as a civilian instructor, but with a new understanding of her role in military education. The warehouse exercise had been about teaching humility to overconfident recruits. The range incident had been about preventing casualties among young soldiers who'd confused recklessness with courage. Morrison completed his training and went on to serve as a competent, if unremarkable, junior officer. His experience with Maria had fundamentally changed his approach to military service, replacing his earlier arrogance with a healthy respect for the complexity and dangers of real combat. More importantly, the story of both incidents became part of the informal curriculum at Fort Braxton. New recruits were told about the female instructor who'd single-handedly defeated 5 armed opponents, then later prevented a live-fire training disaster through unconventional tactics and superior skill. The stories served their intended purpose, teaching young soldiers that military effectiveness wasn't about physical dominance or aggressive posturing. It was about intelligence, creativity, and the wisdom to recognize when you were outmatched by a superior opponent. Maria herself remained characteristically modest about her achievements. When asked about the incidents, she consistently emphasized that her success had come from training, preparation, and the willingness to think beyond conventional parameters. She'd simply applied the lessons she'd learned during 12 years of military service to situations that required unconventional solutions. But those who served with her knew the truth. Maria Santos wasn't just a skilled instructor or a competent veteran. She was what Special Forces training was designed to produce, a warrior whose greatest weapon was her mind, and whose greatest strength was her ability to turn any tactical disadvantage into a strategic opportunity. The young soldiers who served under her instruction carried those lessons with them throughout their military careers, passing them on to new generations of recruits who would face their own moments of challenge and uncertainty. In the end, that was Maria's real victory. Not the tactical success in a training exercise, not the prevention of casualties in a dangerous situation, but the knowledge that she'd helped create better soldiers who understood what it truly meant to serve their country with honor, intelligence, and humility.